Okay, so today we're going to be going over the lesson from 1112, 1113. We're going to start with our PowerPoint, which is on railroads and industry. So as we consider the progression of railroads and the development of industry, think about how people moved goods and resources around the country before railroads. So prior to 1840, how would you get things from Michigan Territory, Missouri, all the way to Maine or to Virginia? So, before railroads, the primary methods of transportation were rivers, canals, and roads. As you can see here, we have a lot of main roads. We have, looks like the Wilderness Road connects to the Nashville Road, goes all the way to Memphis. But they only had horses, though, to take them over roads. So consider, what were some of the challenges people had to deal with using these types of transportation?
At the end of the Civil War, there were just 35,000 miles of railroad track in the entire United States, located chiefly in the lands east of the Appalachian Mountain Range. By 1900, there were 193,000 miles of track, including 4 transcontinental railroad lines that linked the east and west coasts. Nearly 60% of the domestically produced steel fed the seemingly endless appetite for new railroad tracks. The railroad drastically changed life in America. Prior to the Transcontinental Railroad, it took months to cross the country in slow, horse-drawn stagecoaches. The journey was arduous and dangerous, and many pioneers who left the East in search of a better life out west instead found their fates. The railroad cut travel time of a 3,000-mile trip from coast to coast from months to roughly 1 week. The rate of shipping and communication increased with the speed of the locomotive, and this had repercussions in almost every other industry in the Gilded Age.
So here we have a image of the U.S. and their railroads before 1860. So in 1830, the U.S. was really just South Carolina up to Maine on the eastern seaboard. And if you can see, there's a tiny little railroad here, a couple in Pennsylvania, and there might be one in Maryland. 10 years later, you see a little bit more. The line from South Carolina is going farther in. It goes all the way to Georgia. You got one from North Carolina going up to D.C. D.C. looks like there's one that goes to Boston. Some more in New York. Some around Michigan and Ohio. And then 1850, you see a little more. But you still see these big chunks of places like Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, this area, and Florida that don't have any railroads. And there's a big chunk in Maine. So at the start of the Civil War, there's a lot more railroads, primarily concentrated in the north. If you think back to what we talked about last year in 6th grade, one of the biggest weaknesses of the South was that it didn't have the railroad lines that the North had. So they couldn't move troops and supplies as fast as the North could. And then in 1870, 10 years later, we have the Transcontinental Railroad. It goes all the way out to California. But look at all this area that belongs to the U.S. that has nothing. You'd have to take a horse and buggy, probably over some really crappy dirt paths. Then 1880, we see a little more. Basically, the Midwest is covered in railroads. Remember, these are going to be where the major industries start popping up. Detroit. We got the automobile industry in Detroit. Steel in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh will be right here. Meat packing in Illinois, in Chicago. So it makes sense. If all the cattle farms are out here, the beef is being taken by rail to Chicago where it's getting slaughtered, and then to markets up and down the rest of the country. And then 1890, even more railroads. We got it going all the way to Washington, the corner of Washington, the bottom of Texas and Florida. And then 1898. Looks like there's lines that go even into Mexico and Canada. So what is the relationship between natural resources, factories, national markets, and railroads? So we start with the natural resources. They get gathered up, taken by train to factories where they're processed into finished products or capital resources, and then sent to national markets to be sold, which then require more natural resources to go to the factories, and so on. It's an endless cycle of railroads carrying natural resources, finished goods, and money. So we have natural resources from the West. They're the raw materials that go into the factories in the East. The finished products go to markets across the nation. More finished products are needed, so they go back to the natural resources from the West. So, moving natural resources such as iron and ore to Eastern factories, moving natural resources such as copper and lead to Eastern factories, moving iron ore deposits to sites of steel mills in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, transporting finished products to national markets. Manufacturing areas located near centers of population. What types of manufacturing centers were located in American cities? We had, in New England, the textile industry. And a textile is a type of cloth or woven fabric. In Detroit, we have the automobile industry. And Henry Ford creates the assembly line, which means there's like a lot of one person puts on the tires, person puts in the brakes, and they're all the same tires and brakes. Then in Pittsburgh, we have the steel industry, which was led by Andrew Carnegie. Lots of steel mills, and iron and carbon equals steel. So it's going to be right here. And Pittsburgh is right in the center of Three Rivers. The Steelers football stadium used to be called Three Rivers Stadium, which made it easy to transport steel and iron ore over boat, but also by railroad. So here we have a railroad crossing right here, and then 10 years later, look at it. So, in Chicago, we had the meat packing industry. Cattle is herded to train stations in Kansas and then shipped to Chicago. Meat transported from Chicago to cities across the nation to be sold. So they'd start in this is where they'd round up all the cattle to put them on the trains. Then they'd get slaughtered and the meat would get sent around the country. And that's it for our PowerPoint. But we're going to go back and do our assignments now. We'll start with the student copy. That'll be assignments 11, 12, 11, 13. Okay. Okay, for our assignments, we have a warm-up. Remember, flat lands that rise gradually from east to west, land eroded by wind and water, low rainfall, frequent dust storms. Remember, these are all the features and the climate of the Great Plains. Another set of review questions. What are 2 ways farmers adapted to the dry, harsh conditions of the Great Plains? So think about the different inventions they had to use. What did they use windmills for? How did they get their water? What did they start growing that was easier to grow on the Great Plains? How did they plow through the sod that was much harder and more like clay than dirt back east? They couldn't use wood plows. They had to use what kind of plows? And what was barbed wire for? Consider, before railroads, how did people move goods and resources around the country? So you'll put your answer in here. Remember, you still have the we can still use our PowerPoint, so you can go back to it. Transportation before railroads. Now we're going to fill in our notes page, which is going to come from our little handy dandy chart here. So in that first circle, this top circle, you'll put natural resources from the west. In the arrow, raw materials. Second circle, factories in the east. Second arrow, finished products. Then the bottom circle is going to be on the next slide just because it didn't fit. So you'll put markets across the nation, and then in that third arrow, more finished products. And we have our notes page. So remember, we are moving natural resources such as lead and copper to eastern factories, moving iron ore deposits to sites of steel mills in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, transporting finished products to national markets. And then for slides 7, 8, 9, and 10, you're going to fill in the different industries. New England and textile, Detroit automobile, Pittsburgh steel, Chicago meat packing. Use the PowerPoint. This is the end of the assignments for 11, 12, 11, 13.